I think we can do a lot by changing idea of what it means to be human, and also like what does it mean to have community that is not just human community. Because when we say community, we're talking about the human community, and so how can we start to shift that language?
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fandy Show.
Without a positive vision of the future, we'll have no future.
A good one. I'm Sean.
I'm Daniel.
And this month, in place of a Skiffy and Fandy Clack show, we're doing a genre discussion on Solarpunk with two very special guests, Sarena Ulibarri and Pheobe Wagner. And so welcome to the show, you two.
Welcome.
Thanks.
So, Sarena Ulibarri is a speculative fiction author and editor. Her short stories have appeared in Lightspeed, Solarpunk magazine, and elsewhere. Her novella, Another Life, was published this year by Stelliform Press. As an editor, she has curated and published several international volumes of optimistic climate fiction, including Glass and Gardens, Solarpunk Summers, and its follow-up, Solarpunk Winters, and Multi-Species Cities, Solarpunk Urban Futures. Thanks for joining us, Sarena.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Pheobe Wagner is an author, editor, and academic writing at the intersection of speculative fiction and climate change. Their debut novel, A Shot of Gin, what a lovely title, by the way, is newly released from Parliament House Press, and her novella, When We Hold Each Other Up, can be found from Android Press. She's the editor of 3 Solarpunk anthologies, including Sunvault, Stories of Solarpunk and Eco-Speculation, and Fighting for the Future, Cyberpunk and Solarpunk Tales. And thank you for joining us, Phoebe.
Thank you.
So before we get to the Solarpunk discussion, some quick requests for you, our listeners. Please share your comments with us about this and past episodes at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions or on our Discord channel. Some of these questions might get discussed right here on Skiffy and Fanty or our Patreon supporter exclusive Speculative Dispatch show. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter already, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty to enjoy more exclusive content.
All right, so let's start with the big question, because I think I know what Solarpunk is. I think Daniel thinks he knows what Solarpunk is. But it may be something that some of our listeners are not very familiar with, and rather than just sending them to Wikipedia, I think it'd be great to ask you two to kind of explore, well, how do each of you define Solarpunk? And I suppose I'll start with this question. We'll start with Sarena, and then we'll go to Phoebe, and then we can kind of bounce back and forth.
I define Solarpunk as optimistic climate fiction that focuses on solutions, community action, and a culture of care. So it's kind of those 4 elements. It has to deal with climate change. It has to have that culture of care. It has to deal with collective action, not just, individual action. And now I've already forgotten the 4th one, but the intersection of those things is what I consider Solarpunk. That's my current working definition.
Phoebe, what about you?
Yeah, so for me, I define Solarpunk as that a Solarpunk imagines new futures in the midst of and in opposition to environmental collapse, and that those futures are also realizing that we can't have environmental justice without also social justice. And so the interweaving of those two, that's always been an important aspect of Solarpunk for me. And so therefore, Solarpunk has to be actively anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and engaged in those ideas as well. And then finally, too, that even though technology plays a major role in Solarpunk, it's about having the right tool for the right moment. So a shovel is a piece of technology, as well as writing a new piece of code is a piece of technology. And so thinking about what is the right tool in the right moment. And those are some of the working definitions that I have when I think about Solarpunk and when I'm working on Solarpunk. Though, Sarena, I really like that culture of care. I think that's a great phrase to incorporate, to think about when working on a Solarpunk piece.
And for me, both the culture of care and the collective action, that all incorporates the social justice and accessibility and all of those things, the anti-racism, all of that is folded into those terms when I use them. So yeah, 100%.
I want to unpack this a little bit because both of you have I don't know if you both think of this explicitly, but essentially each of your definitions has, at least in part, at the root of it, some of what we might think of as like the critical utopian tradition, looking at especially like the 60s and 70s, trying to like tear down institutions and build some form of better future, even if it's not necessarily like idealistic in the most perfect sense. And and both of you have that in different ways. This sort of idea of a culture of care to me seems a rather utopian idea because that can have so many different machinations. And then obviously woven within that from Phoebe, this idea of being anti-racist, anti-capitalist, trying to build a future that isn't rooted in fundamental inequalities, I suppose. And I don't know if both of you kind of feel that utopian tradition is sort of woven into this, if that's explicit. And I'll take it the opposite direction this time and start with you, Phoebe.
Yeah, I think Solarpunk and Utopia has always had an interesting relationship. Solarpunk was, I think, really popularized in the starting around the 2015-ish, 2013 era in the US through social media. And that's also when we were seeing a rise in dystopian literature from like Hunger Games on up. We also had like Mad Max Fury Road came out in 2015. And so I think there was definitely a reaction to this sense of if we're popularizing and really imagining a lot of dystopian futures, then what are we actually going to build in the future? But at the same time, like we need these alternatives, right? But at the same time, I think I do not see Solarpunk as utopian, just because it's so wrestling with climate change. And I think if we look at utopias, oftentimes they are like, if they're a true utopia and not like Le Guin's ambiguous utopia, there is not going to be that threat of natural disaster, or like a drought or something like that quite as explicit. At least that's my reading of a lot of utopia. So I think Solarpunk is really wrestling with how do we adapt, and I think utopia is oftentimes past that at the point of adaptation. Like the adaptation has already happened, and so Solarpunk's wrestling with that actual transformation versus post-transformation.
Yeah, what about you, Sarena? How do you approach this?
So I agree that it's not entirely like a Solarpunk community is not a utopia, but I still think that Solarpunk imagining is utopian in nature, in the sense that we are working toward that sense of utopia. To me, all like political systems and philosophical systems are utopian at their core, and they're never implemented perfectly, right? And especially, I always say I don't believe in utopia because people live in it. And people will make a mess of anything. So long as there are human beings in this world, it's never going to be perfect. But I do think that it is a utopian thought experiment, even just to look at better futures, even if it's not a perfect future, because like Phoebe said, we're dealing with climate change, and we're dealing with a world in which we're going to have to adapt, a world we are already adapting to the changes in our environment. So I don't necessarily look at it as perfect, but as better. And to touch on your point about the critical utopias of the 60s and 70s, to me, we're definitely building on all of that imagination, all of that work that was done. My mother was a flower child in the 60s, and she always says flower child. She's not a hippie, she was a flower child. And and the whole Earth catalog from the 70s is a huge foundation of Solarpunk, even if we don't realize it. It took me a long time to discover that, but once I looked through it, I was like, oh yeah, this is where a lot of our ideas took root, or at least there were the seeds of it, and then we have sort of grown from those ideas. So yeah, we're definitely working on the foundation of those critical utopias of the mid 20th century.
I think something that kind of comes out to me in both of the ways you're thinking. You're both. If I could make a sentence that makes sense, the thing that's really standing out to me here is I think we're all in kind of an agreement. This idea of like that old school utopian tradition where like you just imagine the end point. It doesn't really matter how exactly we got there, but like, hey, it's the beautiful, like it's the perfect society for us right now. But both of you are kind of talking about the like impulse, that utopian impulse to make a better world. And I think you're both right. Like, as long as humans are involved in this, like, it's going to be imperfect. It's going to be flawed. It's going to have all its weird things. I'm glad, Phoebe, you brought up Le Guin, because that I was thinking the dispossessed in my head that exact moment. Like, the best possible place you could make in a world with, it's like a desert planet with no resources. This might be the best we can do. And it may not be the place I want to live, but the alternative is everybody's dead. So what do you do at that point? So I like that if we think of Solarpunk as maybe at its core, trying to be more positive and trying to think about solutions and ways of thinking and being that are better than what we're doing presently, even if like the end point is not entirely defined, I suppose is where kind of both of you seem to be taking my brain at this moment. We don't know what the solution to climate change exactly is going to look like, but we're going to come up with something, or we're all not going to be here anymore.
Well, and the infuriating thing about climate change is that there is no one solution. There are a lot of solutions, and again, that collective action. But in terms of telling a good Solarpunk story, a lot of people get stuck on that of like, if everything's better, where's the story, right? And I think of it as you said, the end point. The end point maybe is utopia. We don't tell stories about the end point. We tell stories about the road on the way there.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up. I was thinking the same exact thing, Sarena, is that's one of the things I think that makes Solarpunk unique, or has the opportunity to really open up Solarpunk, is that there isn't one solution to climate change, and that there's going to be these different community responses and adaptations. And one reason that's so important that Solarpunk is a global genre, that it does have this plethora of voices, is for that very reason. Like, I'm not going to be able to imagine that one solution, but I might have some ideas for my community in central Pennsylvania, where I've spent a lot of time. And so being able to bring in all these different voices and also tell stories from these specific communities, I think is also an important aspect.
From what I've read
100%,
of the genre, it's very much is about the process of working towards something, as we've kind of said. And one of the things that struck me about it always was it always leads with this idea of optimism. But then of the Solarpunk that I've read, when you first approach the stories, you don't immediately get the sense of that optimism necessarily. Some of them, yes, but many of them, they're still very dark. They're still filled with a dirty world. And there's only a glimmer of that optimism maybe in there, a nugget that the reader can kind of hold on to based on some speculative fiction idea. And that's something that I've liked about Solarpunk. And if you haven't read it before and you just read the description about it being optimistic, you might not realize that it still has darkness to it, because it is about that process.
Well, and I think that's where the punk comes in. I mean, I think it's a punk genre for a reason, and I staunchly defend the punk aspect to it. And I think that's one area where we see it, where it's not just all like sunshine. Like, there is this, it's a dirty world. There are people recovering from corrupt systems and systemic oppression. In addition to having that glimmer, though, that we can transform, we can make this better place. And so, yeah, I always see that as the punk, because I'm always trying to find that balance too, where it's not just optimism, but this recognition of the trouble that we're in and the systemic issues that we're trying to adapt to and transform and deconstruct.
Yeah, I'll just say, it's not as cozy as a lot of people seem to assume in the beginning, but you're right. It's because it is a punk genre. We are pushing against that mainstream narrative that we are doomed and there is nothing we can do about it. And, and it has, radical empathy and things like that require work and require a realistic view of the world and the darkness of that world, as well as the light.
So would it be correct in thinking that cyberpunk has been more geared towards individualistic and capitalistic or anarchistic attempts at combating things, and this is more collective? or is that not the case? I know, Phoebe, you talked about, anti-capitalist natures of Solarpunk.
I think it depends on what cyberpunk you're reading. Like the anthology I just did, I think is starting to like push back against some of the maybe individualism that got popularized in cyberpunk through Blade Runner, and through certain earlier like adaptations. And so the pieces that are in Fighting for the Future are very like community driven. But yeah, I think in general, we usually think of the lone hacker squirreled away in a room somewhere when we think of cyberpunk. Whereas with Solarpunk, I think it's the opposite. It's like more of a community that comes to mind for people familiar with the genre. So I think they're each, and cyberpunk almost always starts in a much more dystopic setting and doesn't always, it's oftentimes not it's pushing back against dystopia, but it's not trying to end that dystopia, I think is how I'd put it. It's surviving the dystopia rather than perhaps like blowing it up. And so I think that is like a way that's a little bit different than Solarpunk 2.
Building up as opposed to breaking down.
That actually makes a lot of sense, and it depends on the cyberpunk that you're looking at, because the original cyberpunk, when you go back to Mirror Shades or to Walter John Williams' Hardwired, or things like that, is rather different than Blade Runner or The Matrix or some of the big screen cyberpunk that has become so iconic, and it was much more anti-capitalist and things like that in that original form, and it got kind of co-opted as it became more popular, and a little less punk in that co-option. So I don't know.
I think you're both right that I think, Sarita, you're identifying the problem cyberpunks run into, which is it got popular and then everyone went, trench coats are really cool, wear the sunglasses, isn't it neat? Like we kind of lose to some degree the fact that so many great cyberpunk tales are kind of what Phoebe is describing, where it's like, I mean, like the movie Hackers would be a great example of this. Like it's a bunch of teenagers, collecting together to take down essentially one individual in charge of like an evil corporate system. But it doesn't end with like the entire system taken down. And I think that's kind of what both of you are sort of suggesting, which is, yeah, there may be collective action, but the idea is the entire system doesn't get pulled to the ground and rebuilt. It's maybe individual or one group of individuals gets justice brought upon them versus, like an entire society bringing justice, which perhaps Solarpunk is aiming more towards, perhaps.
I think it's more community justice focused. I think some Solarpunk is really leaning into that, whereas I think not always is cyberpunk leaning into that. I think maybe like we can see it more commonly in Solarpunk.
I think that's cool, by the way, just FYI. Because I don't mind like a person sitting in a room like, I'm going to be the hacker today and I'm going to take down evil corporate Bob. But at the same time, like a lot of cyberpunk is dystopian, and even at the end of it, like the systems are still in place. They haven't fixed everything. It's just tomorrow it's another evil corporate Bob. So it's kind of not fair, guys.
Yeah. Solarpunk is kind of a flip side of cyberpunk in a lot of ways. Just aesthetically, sort of, bringing the light rather than the dark, and the natural rather than the neon and things like that. And cyberpunk has this saying of move fast and break things, right? And the solarpunk equivalent is move slow and plant things.
It's like Johnny Appleseed, perhaps.
Who was a rebel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that also calls to mind, like as a biologist, Solarpunk has resonated with me because so much of it centers on ecology. Ecology of human communities, but then also communities of all of life. And a guiding ecological principle for everything that a lot of cultures in humanity, at least in my opinion, have lost is senses of balance and things. And it seems that Solarpunk has within its concepts ideas that when you are making changes to survive the dystopia or to improve the dystopia and move past things, not necessarily solve the climate change, but find ways to improve and survive it. It involves making changes, but those changes aren't going to be catastrophic ones. They're ones that are implemented to try to encourage balance. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think balance is a huge key to Solarpunk. I often will kind of, define it as like a balance of nature and technology, where we do have this high tech, but it's not in an exploitative, way. It is a way we're using technology in a way that is in balance with nature. So that's a key word for me that you brought up.
Yeah, and I think too, like I think a lot about intentionality, and like bringing that back to the forefront of like for communities that are not just the human community, but the entire community, and help and like thinking about how we approach that balance.
It's it's got to be really hard to write, I imagine, just because as a biologist, the more I look at things, I think like even just trying to cure diseases, we poke around, but then we make the situation worse because we stop people getting sick, but now we don't have parasites, so our immune system stinks, so we die anyway. And so it's just so incredibly challenging to live life and still maintain those balances without disrupting things.
And I think that's
So,
one reason it's so important to have so many different voices in solar
mm,
punk, because like it's like I can't, yeah, it's the hardest thing I write. Whenever I sit down to write a solar punk story, it's the most difficult thing I attempt. And so I'm not going to be able to, I don't have all the pieces. I'm always going to other voices and reading more and working on my own internal issues, and like engaging with my community in order to try and like get the compost and the fuel necessary to actually sit down and write a successful piece of solar punk. So yeah, like it's by far the hardest thing that I do when I sit down as a writer.
I agree. It's definitely a challenge. And it is easier to see how, or it's easy to imagine how things go wrong.
mm,
It is much easier to write the dystopian or the apocalyptic, or even to like right. A lot of people approach solar punk with like a blank slate idea, meaning like the apocalypse did happen, or something crashed so much that we're basically starting over. And it's much easier for a lot of writers to imagine that way. It's much more challenging to imagine a better trajectory from now. But that's the challenge that we're taking up, and that we're asking other writers to take up when they're approaching solar punk is how do we do that hard work of thinking through the way that things could be better. It is very challenging.
yeah, and I think having diverse voices in that of thinking about how to meet those challenges is exceptionally important because so many different cultures have different ways of viewing the world and different ways of looking at connections or appreciation of balances that can bring that perspective to the table, I guess.
Definitely, definitely. And that was one reason that I found it so important to bring the Brazilian anthology into English. So through World Weaver Press, I ran that Kickstarter
Mm-hmm.
that funded the translation of the Brazilian anthology. And I didn't know what the stories were about. I didn't know if they were any good. I just knew they needed to be part of the conversation, and that we could not leave out the global south, and especially when they were the first ones to use the term, like that was an
Mm-hmm.
important foundation. And then we've with the multi-species city anthology, so that goes back to Daniel, what you were saying earlier about not just a human community, but a whole diversity of the ecosystem. We have stories in that from all over the world, and about all kinds of different community of mangrove trees, for example, is a or the, birds or fungi. There's all kinds of non-human creatures that get their stories told as well. And that I can't tell a story about mangrove forest from my home in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I don't know that ecosystem, right? But someone in the Philippines told that story,
Mm-hmm.
and because that is incredibly important, in their climate and in their ecosystem. So yeah, we definitely need the diversity of human voices, and human voices giving voice to non-human.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really interesting idea that, uh, like animal fantasy, animal science fiction is always kind of, it's been around for, generations, centuries, really. If not longer than that, millennia, I guess. But you're not wrong. Like if you're talking this Brazilian anthology, like we're talking about the Amazon and the sheer volume of animals that exist there, and what are their lives under climate change, and what responsibility, I suppose, do we as humans, these bizarre thinking agents who are on Twitch right now, like what responsibility do we have in that, and to like try to think about their perspectives as best as we possibly can, I suppose, being humans. And I was just watching like on YouTube the other day, like these people being super excited because they may have found a species they thought was extinct in the Amazon. Like they caught this monkey and they were just like looking at the back of this monkey from like a camera in the middle of the woods, and he's like about to like freak out because he thinks it's this monkey he thinks has been extinct for all this time, and then it turns out it's the one everybody thought was extinct. He was so excited, and I was like, well, yeah, but now we need to have the conversation of how did it end up extinct and what do we now do? Like, what responsibility do we have that one monkey? That, I mean, does that one monkey have like significant others? Like, how do we save that one monkey now? I think like I'm rambling, but because the animal thing is such a big deal. Like even just in the last couple of years, we've gotten news of animals that there are still animals of them left, but we know they're going to go extinct because there's either no females or there's no males left. And so we're like sitting here literally on this, we're these humans watching these animals, knowing in a few years that's it, they're gone forever. And that's like, how do you find? I'm rambling. I'm sorry, but like now I'm getting like really sad. Because what is Solarpunk's answer to this problem? Like, help me save the animals, please.
Sarena, do you want to go? You have that new anthology coming out, so I feel like you should go first.
Yeah, the new anthology is called Solarpunk Creatures, and it is all about more. We call it the more than human world. But again, there's not one. I don't know. There's not one solution, and let's see. I don't know. I wrote this essay for Strange Horizons called "Hope and Horror in Climate Fiction," and it actually just won the like Utopian Award for nonfiction. And in that, I was analyzing two stories that were very similar with very different approaches. One was The Impossible Resurrection of Grief by Octavia Cade, which is a novella, and the other is The Birdsong Fossil by D.K. Mock, which I published in the Multi-Species Cities anthology. And they're both dealing with extinction and with this proposed solution of sort of creating robotic animals to either replace the animal in the ecosystem or to kind of like assist. Like there's a whole thing in the Birdsong Fossil about cranes that have been cloned, but they need they don't know how to be cranes, and so we have like robotic cranes that help them like learn their things. So anyway, I don't have an answer, but I did kind of analyze these two approaches to it, one very dystopian and one very solarpunk, and how they're both really powerful for dealing with that climate grief and that climate anxiety that I just saw you like spiraling into when we start thinking about extinction, right? Yeah. And so, this is one of the ways that climate fiction is useful, and not that stories have to have use, but this is one of the functions of climate fiction, is to help us process these really horrible emotions dealing with climate grief. And so hopefully the Solarpunk Creatures anthology can help with that as well. And and I think a lot of solarpunk, that so long as we're dealing with more than human worlds, that can help us process some of that.
Yeah, I was really thinking about this in my novella, When We Hold Each Other Up, and I really wanted to try and figure out how to engage with this. One thing that's been really inspiring for me, and like I said, it's really shaped my thinking in this, is also Robin Wall Kimmer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a creative nonfiction collection. But she has an amazing essay called Learning the Grammar of Animacy. And in that one, it basically says like it's one of the major pieces that kind of like got stuck in my head was just even changing the language that we use. So Robin Wall Kimmer is an indigenous biologist, and she talks about how another scientist she knew when talking about the animal they were studying would say, well, a friend has passed by, not like a specimen, but they would just like change the language. And that was like the one example that's like coming to mind right off the bat. But that essay just really thinks about how do we engage thoughtfully in this moment? And one of the things that I try to do, and one of the ways I think Solarpunk can be powerful, is redefining community to include not just the human community, but the non-human or more than human community. Because it's not even just animals, right? It's like the rivers and the mountains and the, the fungi and like what's rotting beneath our feet. And then how does that change our approach to the world? And also, how does that help us undermine systems of oppression? Because who gets defined as human has been, of course, a way to oppress people globally, but particularly in the US. And so like recognizing that the idea of what being a human is also a way to oppress people and to remove humanity and to remove rights. I think we can do a lot by changing idea of what it means to be human, and also like what does it mean to have community that is not just human community? Because when we say community, we're talking about the human community, and so how can we start to shift that language? And that's something I was really trying to play around with in my Solarpunk novella, and like something I really try to think about when I'm writing Solarpunk literature. But it's changing a worldview, right? Like that's not how my brain functions in the world currently. And that's one thing I really liked about Learning the Grammar of Animacy by Robin Wall Kimmerer, as it kind of approaches shifting how you see the world.
Breeding Sweetgrass should be essential reading, required reading for anybody who's interested in any of these issues. It should be required for reading for everybody, honestly.
This idea of like you're making me think about like historically all of the different groups of people, human people who have like lived in some form of synergy, I suppose you could call it, with some animals. Whether not, and I don't just mean specifically like like work animals or like pets, which we all kind of I think recognize, but even just like the natural creatures that sort of lived there. Like looking at ancient cultures who like, whether the birds realized it or not, like would follow birds because it would show them where they needed to go for fishing or whatever. To some degree, I wonder if like we're so technologically advanced that maybe we've like lost some of that because we don't all have connections in nature, really. I mean, maybe with pigeons if you live in a big city, but people tend not to like pigeons that much. But
I don't know, like I see where you're coming from. I lately have been thinking about it in terms of how we've established the human as being better, which I think is more in our heads versus technology, but that also supports that idea of humans being better, right? And that goes all the way back to like the chain of being, right? And like just Western philosophy in general, and the Enlightenment era and all these different things that we've built so much of our literature, history, our humanities in general off of. And then of course that's infecting our education system. And so that's kind of the way I've been tracing it when I've been thinking about it. Because if we've just been so told for so long that we are the top of the food chain, that we are the best as humans, then that's going to filter in from childhood on down, right? And so like, how do we then undermine this quote unquote Western ideology and like shift how we look at the world, away from a human supremacist, which is also so often a white supremacist lens, like if we go all the way back to the patriarchal religious chain of being and how that was utilized.
Yeah, as a microbiologist, I like the panic that I have over climate change and such is the loss of microbial diversity that we're seeing in just within the humans too. So if you want to like only care about humans, there's a destruction of diversity within us that's affecting things in scary ways that we don't understand. And within communities out there in other ecosystems outside of the human ecosystem, there's species, and there's a relatively few number of species that are capable of fixing nitrogen. If they're gone, it's game over. There's nothing else that exists to fix nitrogen. And we're starting to see decreases of diversity globally in that regard. And so that's very worrisome. The story you mentioned, Sarena, about the crane, that's based on an actual experiment, if I recall, where a researcher actually flew in a like glider to help train the young cranes how to navigate. Is that correct? Or to your memory?
Yeah, I know that both of these stories were pulling from the same research. And I'm sure it's that same one that you're mentioning. I don't remember the details of it myself, but yeah, these are, two authors that heard about that, read about that, and let their imaginations go into very different ways from that.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so the other thing that came up from the discussions that I was curious about is Phoebe mentioned this indigenous author, and I do hope we can get a list of things for like the show notes of works that you've mentioned. But
I'm on it, don't worry.
Okay, good. Is there a fair amount of intersection, you would say, between solarpunk with Afrofuturism, indigenous futurism, and other futurisms? Or like how much communication is there, I guess, between these different subgenres or ways of approaching speculative fiction?
That's a great question. I think one, I'm not, I think a lot of times the people that are also writing indigenous futurism or Afrofuturism or African futurism we're thinking about similar things. But I think it's also really important to make clear the genre distinctions, because sometimes I'll see someone call an Afrofuturist text like, oh, this is like a solarpunk story. And unless the author has explicitly stated that, I think it's really important to like respect the author's intentions of what genre they were using or how they define their work, because these are genres that are developing and have different aims and goals than solarpunk. Like, I think there's certainly like a Venn diagram of overlap happening, particularly in just imagining different futures. But like I think just they're still separate, right? And like being clear about that. But certainly like engaging in that, that the importance of the sci-fi genre, right? Of imagining these futures, and that we can't build towards these futures unless we've imagined them. Adrienne Marie Brown is very clear about that in Emergent Strategies, and as well as other authors and activists, that, imagining the futures is step one. And we've been doing that for a long time. And so it's important to be bringing in these diverse voices as we are imagining these futures and recognizing the previous imaginations that are part of that archive.
Yeah, I'll add to that I agree that they are sort of overlapping but separate things. Indigenous futurism and Afrofuturism and those kinds of things. There's actually a whole slew of Brazilian ones too that I will get the names wrong if I try to pull them out of my head. But there are several types of futurisms coming out of South America too, and I think of them kind of as like convergent evolution. Like we are looking at very similar ideas and even sometimes similar approaches, but they're kind of coming from different branches and different origins. And there hasn't been as much overlap as we maybe would hope there would be. A lot of Native writers or African writers that I've spoken to about solarpunk, they're not so into it because they coming from the history that that their communities have dealt with. They're less interested in this optimism part of it, because they're kind of let's see, how do I say this? Like they've already experienced, multiple apocalypses,
right?
And so, they're approaching it in a different way than many other writers are. And, so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So, so I'll throw it out to folks in chat if they have any questions they'd like us to ask, because we can't keep you guys here forever.
Yeah.
Because at some point you have lives you have to go back to. I assume. But I suppose I wanted to ask kind of a different way of thinking about the optimism, because at the very beginning, I'm going to kind of like circle back, I suppose. The very beginning, we had talked about like collective action and community action and a sense of perhaps degrees of optimism about various kinds of solutions we could create in those communities. And I wonder if in thinking of that question, how in your experience, in your knowledge, are there works of solarpunk that are sort of thinking about actually creating that conversation across cultures, where maybe the solutions that are being offered are not necessarily always going to work together in the perfect way, but that that idea of sharing and exchanging of ideas and working together towards common and different goals that maybe get to somewhat of the same place. Maybe that's some part of that community action in Solarpunk that you're aware of. That's kind of where I'm really curious.
So the story that reminds me of immediately is the first story in Glass and Garden Solarpunk Summers, which is Caught Root by Julia K. Patt. And that's exactly what it is. It's two communities who have is two kind of solarpunk communities who have developed their little mini utopia in different ways with different strategies. One is very, very nature based. One is very technology based. They're both interested in sustainability. They're both interested in community care, things like that, but they have different strategies for it. And the story is about an ambassador from one of those communities going to the other. And so that sounds like kind of what you're describing. And they're not actual cultures, it's not, it's not like someone, from Africa going to France or, something like that. It's not like actual communities, but it's a metaphor for those kinds of differences in real communities. So that's the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah, I wonder if one reason we're not seeing it at the cultural level is because Solarpunk has not made the jump fully to novels yet. And like to have like cultures, you need that like length, to really do it right, especially on a delicate subject like that. And then one story that came to mind is The Scent of Green by Anna Sun, who that's in Fighting for the Future. And it's not quite as direct as the story you were talking about, Sarena, but one of the things I liked about it is it's about this person who goes to this community that needs to attract more people to the community in order for it to keep running, because it is an important producer of algae for different reasons, and they can't get people to come because it like smells bad. Like, I don't want to spoil the story, so I'm going to go there, but they're very distrustful of this person that's sort of sent to help them figure out this problem, because they think it's like that the things that the solutions she has will not be effective for their community. And so it's kind of like this outsider coming in that's from these other communities, and like, how are they all going to work together, and like, can they come up with a solution? But I certainly think this, I'm starting to see more often, like just from these examples we were bringing up, and like I was thinking about this in my novella too. Like, one thing I think Solarpunk needs to be careful about is not homogenizing and being like, okay, this is how we're going to approach every problem. And so I think it's important that we do have these stories, just like you described, Sean, that are showing that we can have a plurality of approaches to these issues, whether it's stemming from culture, from region, from like just the resources available, like however it comes down to it. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing, that we shouldn't try and come up with this global or continental solution.
So we do have
Anna Soon has a story in Solarpunk Creatures too that sounds like a very similar theme, where it's a human character who is negotiating a conflict between two different species of birds. And and they had the technology to like speak to the birds and stuff. But yeah,
that's kind of fun.
Yeah,
I like that. So we have a question in chat. This is from Tanya, and Tanya asks, if apocalyptic / post-apocalyptic, if a apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic storyteller is imagining what's the worst that could happen, what will the storytellers who have experienced these worst things, what could they imagine? I think is the question. Am I reading that right, Tanya? Because I think I'm misunderstanding. I guess, are you asking? Okay, I'll trim this. Don't worry. But like, I think the question is asking, right, if we're dealing with individuals who have experienced some of the worst possible outcomes in their lives, some of which we had mentioned earlier, how are the people who've experienced that going to imagine perhaps better things? Like, is that a thing that Solarpunk is trying to deal with, of people are living in the worst possible, or their perceived worst possible situation, trying to imagine a better future, or can they? Or is that part of what Solarpunk is perhaps in some cases trying to address, is how do you even be optimistic in the face of all of this? I'm spinning the question a little bit, trying to help my brain too.
I think yes, that is part of what I think Solarpunk is trying to do, and I think that goes back to the culture of care that I was talking about earlier, and the collective action, because an individual may feel hopeless, but their community may, in a Solarpunk world and a Solarpunk story, there's support and there's community, and together we can rise above that. I think there's a there's a story that deals with this that I'm trying to remember. Although one that I'm thinking of was in Solarpunk magazine by Starhawk, and I can't remember the dress. Something about the dress. Anyway, it was in the very first Solarpunk magazine issue, and it's available online now. This was about a trans person who grew up in in our world, and experienced a lot of trauma from that, and now lives in a community where all those issues are non-issues, and and people are in living more sustainably with the earth, and also with each other, and and all these issues of gender and things like that are just not a problem. And their grandchild is going to some kind of dance or something, and this person is pushing a dress on them, saying, this is the dress that meant so much to me when I wore it to my prom, and and things like that. And the grandchild is just not interested in that, because it doesn't fit their world. And so that seems like an example of a story that's dealing with someone who has dealt with a lot of trauma, and how that affects them later on, and how even when they live in a better world, and how their community kind of helps them deal with that trauma.
The brave dress.
So yeah, it's something like that. Yeah. It's something like that, yeah. But I think that's a theme that is rich for exploration in Solarpunk.
So that makes me think of the novella Sortidae by E.G. Condé. Where it kind of begins with devastation and oppression. And it's about a, diverse set of characters that come from very different places, all coming to realizations of how they can overcome that past or work past that past through interactions in their community to make a more optimistic future. And one of the characters, if I'm remembering correctly, because my memory's pretty bad, but if I'm remembering correctly, one of the characters, almost sacrifices themselves in a way of they're doing something that doesn't come natural to them, but they're doing it and stepping into the nest of the enemy in a way to work with someone who you might view as being antagonistic to you, but to work with them in a way that you can actually then build a better future together, as opposed to just fighting them.
Yeah, that's similar to the themes in my novella Another Life too. My science fictional premise is that there's a blood test that can tell you who you were in a previous lifetime, and so the characters are getting their reincarnation results. And my main character, who's kind of the leader of a Solarpunk community, learns that she was a really bad person in her past life, and an oil tycoon, and someone responsible for a lot of the climate issues that they are all now having to live with and adapt to. She tries to keep that secret and tries to deal with it just individually, and eventually has to let the community deal with it with her, and all of that. So yeah, I think these kinds of themes come up in Solarpunk a lot.
And I think too, one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of apocalypse and things like that, we think of apocalypse as having an endpoint. It's something we're working up to, rather than being something that has happened before, that is happening, that will continue to happen. And so breaking that down, I think, is important when we think about an apocalyptic story. There's places in the U.S. that clearly through genocide and colonialism and settler colonialism have experienced apocalypse. But then there's also places like Paradise, California, that place and those people experienced an apocalypse when the town was absolutely destroyed with wildfires. We're going to see more and more communities have these apocalyptic moments. And so I think that is going to start to influence climate fiction broadly. And I'm sure that will filter into Solarpunk in different ways, in addition to the communities that are currently experiencing apocalypse through oppression and also through other environmental issues in the global South and globally.
I want to say too, to jump on that, is Mad Max and, those kinds of stories. I love those, but they've kind of convinced us that, when the apocalypse happens, it's all dog eat dog and, everybody for themselves and things like that. And in reality, when these kinds of disasters happen, people come together and, and communities, become more resilient through collective action. So, the apocalyptic fiction that we've been fed is not realistic, and it is a fantasy, and it's important to remember the way that people actually react when when the disaster strikes.
Yeah, I was actually just teaching this in my composition class like 2 weeks ago, because so often I think it's important to realize too, like how popular like that narrative is, that men with guns come in the moment there's a disaster, and that the community, you have to protect yourself from your community rather than help your community. And so like it's really important to reverse that. And like a starter book for that is Rebecca Solnit's Paradise Built in Hell is like a good place to start. Then you can kind of branch out from there. But that's just an accessible read that helps, that talks a lot about that research and disaster studies.
This has come up in my classes a couple of times too. What happens if, like, the zombie apocalypse starts and everyone is like, well, we're screwed. And I'm like, no, we live in the cold, like, north in Minnesota. Like, we need to find all of the people who know how to farm. Like, you are at a university. There's some agriculture nerds here. We get them all together and we, like, figure out what we can make that's got maximal calories. We're going to survive. We're going to build fences. We got it, guys. I don't think they're quite as optimistic as I am, but I think we've got zombie apocalypse up here. I think we're good. So, so I don't want to keep everybody forever, but I wanted to ask one last question before we kind of do the closeout. And I was curious, somewhat of a less happy question, but in all of this, right, we're dealing with, people going through pretty terrible things, right? That your entire community can get burned down, or like we're looking in Florida where like people are losing their houses because of hurricanes and floodwaters and all of these things. And so to some degree, right, if we're dealing with a future where we're trying to find a positive outlook, grief is going to be part of that because things are not going to go right. And I was curious how both of you see Solarpunk, either presently or how you would like it to be addressing this question of what we lose in the process of trying to get to some better place, because frankly, we are going to lose things. It's not going to always work out. And it's a sad question, but I think it's an important one because what is going to happen, even if we did all the right things right now, is going to not be easy. And I think it's important to try to find positivity in the pain, as it were. I don't know if that makes sense, but it made sense in my brain. So I think I'll start with you, Phoebe, first.
Yeah. And I think there's so much space for this in Solarpunk. In fact, I think it's necessary, right? We're already seeing, people struggling with climate grief and climate anxiety, and making space for that, I think, is something that Punk 1 has always done. There's always been space for those emotions in Punk, and so there needs to be space for that in Solarpunk. And I think that's why you can have hope in the midst of grief too. So I think, these things are not mutually exclusive. And I think sometimes in Solarpunk, it's easy to forget that, that there's space for these emotions. And that's one reason why, like, I think in both the fiction anthologies I've done, we've ended the collections on these stories that actually deal with grief. AC Wise is A Catalog of Sunlight at the End of the World. And then I'm going to blank on both the title and the author for Fighting for the Future. I don't have my copy with me, but it ends on another story of grief in that one too, in this moment. Because I think even though we are dealing with, we are trying to imagine this better community, like that's part of the cycle too. Like, there's, that's part of it. We're going to have these moments of grief, and we need to come together as a community to help each other out in those moments. And so I think there's certainly space for that. And I'm sometimes frustrated when it seems like people forget that. Like, no, like Solarpunk is not just all sunshine. Like, that is not what the solar means. And so I think it's important to like found that, particularly generationally. That's one thing I really connected to with what you were saying, Sarena, about an older character talking to a younger character in The Brave Dress by Starhawk, was this concept of like how we have this like generational like like emotion, I guess, like knowing the world beforehand and then seeing this better world, and then how do you like bring the two together in your own like personal view and body and things like that. And so that's one way that I like to kind of play around with that in Solarpunk is through time, just the giving characters that have this ability to live through time in different ways. But I think like making space for that is vital to the genre, because like that's what storytelling does, right? It helps us with deal with those emotions. That's one reason why we go to sad stories, or we go to sad movies, or we go to movies that make us angry, or read books that make us angry, is to help us deal with those emotions.
Yeah, definitely the catharsis of it, right? And so I think some of the best solar punk to me lets us have that catharsis, but then doesn't leave us in the down part. It's like we deal with that grief and process that, and then it kind of floats us back up, or at least that's kind of the idea. But that's fascinating, Phoebe, that you were talking about the anthologies ending with a story that deals with grief, because you saying that made me realize that the multi-species cities anthology does that we end with the birdsong fossil, which deals with grief. And then the Solarpunk creatures anthology also does that. We have this beautiful story by Tasha Mehta called Leaf Whispers Ocean Song, and like it's bittersweet and beautiful, and will probably make people cry, and that's what we put as our last story. And it definitely is dealing with grief, both grief of like extinction and personal loss, and and all of these things. And it just felt like the right story to end with, even though this is supposed to be an optimistic collection, and it is, but I think it's that catharsis that we are trying to make space for in Solarpunk stories.
So I lied. There's one more quick question because someone dropped it in chat while you both were talking. I don't know that either of you'll have an answer because I didn't know this other punk thing existed until literally this moment. And that question is from Shan Monster, who asks, how do you compare Solarpunk with Lunar Punk?
Oh,
So you're gonna go for it.
Yeah. Lunar Punk is kind of a newer thing. It's an expansion of solar punk, I think, as the moon is a reflection of the sun. So it's Lunar Punk is aesthetically a little bit darker. If you think just color scheme of solar punk being greens and yellows and oranges, things like that. Lunar Punk is going to be purples and blues and dark reds and things like that. So and it's Solar Punk is in the day, and Lunar Punk is at night, and Solar Punk is about like science and solutions and practical action, and Lunar Punk is about spirituality and the more internal journeys and internal changes. And then those are generalizations, and there's a lot of overlap. And some of the stories that I've published in the Glass and Gardens anthologies could be called Lunar Punk, and it's still something that's being defined. But I had a story in the by the first Lunar Punk anthology, Bioluminescent, which was published by Android Press, and it takes place in Hawaii, and and it almost all of it takes place at night, and we have like bioluminescent tidal pools and orchids that are kind of glowing and look like other creatures, and so there's a sort of magical like ambiance to it, but it's not. I leave in my story, I leave it kind of ambiguous whether it's, it is actual magic or supernatural, or whether it's just the character's experience of this and their sort of internal, and someone that was dealing with grief too. So yeah, the Lunar Punk is still developing, but it's sort of the nighttime to Solar Punk. I don't know if you have other ideas about that, Phoebe.
No, I think that really sums it up. And I think oftentimes I think one thing that is a little bit more Lunar Punk, and Sarena, correct me if I'm wrong, is that's where you'll see like actual like more fantasy style magic come in a little bit, like not necessarily references to like heathenry, paganism, druidism, not necessarily that, but like a little bit more like fantastical. You'll see that more commonly in Lunar Punk than in Solar Punk. Is that fair to say?
I agree with that. And I would also say that when I see a story that's sort of branding itself as solar punk and it is more fantasy, I am more comfortable calling it lunar punk than I am solar punk, because I like to keep solar punk a little bit more science fiction than fantasy. We don't want to fall into magical solutions and things like that aren't things we can actually use to guide us toward better futures. But there's a lot of power in fantasy as well, and a lot of power in metaphors that fantasy stories can bring up. And so yeah, if lunar punk is a term that can capture those stories and guide them to the correct audience, then that's great.
Those are good. This is very interesting, and now I need to go read Bioluminescent because I apparently missed out on some stuff. So,
It's a good anthology, and
Yes.
there's another story by Starhawk in that is amazing.
fantastic. I'm gonna grab it because I don't think I own it
Well,
yet.
thank you for those questions in chat.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. So, two quick questions to end. These are the more about you two as creative human beings. So we'll start with Phoebe with the first part one, which is, what are you working on next?
I'm just in the editing process of a new novel. The working title right now is Do Not Go Gentle. And I'm going into the agent trenches. I do not have an agent, and I am trying to take that step in my career so this is my third time going into the agent trenches. So hopefully third time's the charm. But this is actually a dark academia novel because I'm an assistant professor of creative writing at a small liberal arts. And I really wanted to talk about like the problems of higher ed. I just had my first beta readers come back, and that was one of the things they commented on. Is they said I hate read half of it because it was like, this is what I experience every day as a professor. So that's kind of what I'm working on right now. I have a bunch of short stories and stuff in the works right now, but that novel is kind of what's taken up all the space in my head.
Perfect. And what about you, Sarena?
So I have another novella that's coming out in December. I'm going to hold up the cover for people that can see the screen. It's called Steel Tree. It is solar punk, but it takes place on another planet. It definitely has solar punk themes. This is a science fiction retelling of the Nutcracker. So I have taken the story of the Nutcracker, both based on the ballet and the original E.T.A. Hoffman novella, and put it in space. So this comes out in December, and I have been working on a possible sequel to it. I haven't shown it to Justine or anything yet, but so maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But I've been working on a possible sequel to this, and I use the structure of A Christmas Carol, but also in space. So and with solar punk themes.
Excellent. Daniel, you can take the last of the two.
Okay, so the second question is, where can people find you? So Phoebe, go ahead.
Yeah, so probably the most consistent place to find me in this day and age of social media breakdown is I do have a website, Pheobe-Wagner.com. So that's where all my social media will be linked. I'm also on TikTok. That's probably where I'm the most common, is on TikTok, and I'm at Prof Phoebes on there. But you can also find that through my website, or just look me up on TikTok. So those are probably the most consistent places. I have a Twitter and an Instagram, but I know we're all kind of in that weird zone right now. So yeah, TikTok and my website are the best.
I just started a TikTok, and I don't know if I know what I'm doing yet, but that's okay because it's the Wild West right now.
It's an adventure.
Exactly.
And then Sarena, what about you?
I also have a website, and if you get all the vowels in my name right, I'm very easy to find, which I know is a difficult task, but SarenaUlibarri.com. Social media wise, I'm mainly on Blue Sky, actually, and I use Mastodon as well, which I really like, and it's starting to kind of get Instagram a little bit. I really didn't like Instagram at first, and now I'm warming to it, but yeah, we're all in that kind of social media diaspora right now. I'm not on Twitter anymore at all. But yeah, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Instagram, or just find me on my website.
Perfect. Well, thank you both very much for being here.
Thank you very much.
And giving us your expertise and your thoughts. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Well, I'm glad.
Yeah, thank you for the conversation.
You're welcome. Okay, so for folks that are at home listening to this or presently in chat, as a reminder, if you have any thoughts that you'd like to let us know about, we have a newsletter thingy or a listener suggestion thing. One of those things, it's at skiffingfanty.com/listener suggestions. If you happen to have a Solarpunk story that you really love, let us know. We'd like to have that in our email. So we're on most of the social media sites, except Twitter is being phased out because that place is a nightmare zone from hell. And so we have a link tree that folks can find. It's just linktree/skiffingfanty. You can easily get there. The newsletter and all that good stuff's there, and our Patreon, etc. if you want to support the show. So there's that. Oh God, there's more to the script. Oh my God, our script's so long.
There's you.
There's me. Oh yeah. I have a link tree as well.
Where can we find you?
Yeah, that's the link tree. Just go linktree/Sean Duke, and you'll find all the things. I also am phasing out Twitter of my own because it's a nightmare in which hell goes to die, I guess. But yeah, so you can go there. But obviously, Alphabet Streams is where the Skiffing Fanty Twitch channel will be moving to permanently, so that I can manage my life better. And that's where I'm on Twitch playing games and doing things like this. So yeah, so you can find me there. And Daniel, what about you? Where do people go to find you?
You can find me at reading1000lives.com. That's 1000, or on Blue Sky, also at Reading 1000 Lives.
Well, since Daniel's written his awkward statement at the end, we usually end the show awkward. I'm sorry, Phoebe and Sarena, you didn't know this because I didn't tell you. We end it awkwardly. I guess I'm just gonna go with what you say, Daniel, which is bacteria are fun and you should lather yourself in them.
Yeah. Is life a vast conspiracy of microbes?
Yes. It absolutely is.
I agree.
All right, and on that note, awkward ending and scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.